It was 7:15 on a Wednesday morning, 2 days before my retirement, when my manager shut his office door and slid a manila folder across his desk like a dealer sliding a bad hand. He didn't offer me coffee, he just said corporate wants you to handle one last termination. I opened the folder expecting a chronic absentee. Instead I saw Marcus Dunn's name, and the air in the room thinned. Marcus was a forklift operator I had trained myself, a quiet kid who came in early and left late, a kid who had once fixed my old Buick in the parking lot for free because he said paying back kindness is cheaper than parts. My manager said the numbers don't add up and someone has to take the fall for the inventory loss. He said legal wants it quiet because quiet paperwork bleeds less in court. I said the cameras would show if he was stealing. He said the cameras had been mysteriously offline, then smiled at the word mysteriously like a man admiring his own stage lighting. I said then we don't know he did it. He leaned back and said, Joe, you've been a company man longer than I've been alive. Don't make this messy, sign the papers, wish him well, collect your cake on Friday. My stomach went cold because loyalty had always been simple until that moment. I looked at Marcus's photo in the folder, calloused hands, steady eyes, and I heard my own speeches from safety meetings about doing the right thing when no one is watching. My manager pushed a pen toward me and said, do this for me, Joe. You're almost out, don't blow up your pension on a stranger. I picked up the pen and set it down again because my hand knew something my mouth couldn't say yet. I said I need time. He said you have until lunch. I walked out with the folder under my arm and the plant floor roaring below like a heartbeat I no longer trusted. I shut my office door and stared at the photo while the stampers pounded steel in a rhythm that sounded like a countdown. I thought about my wife's travel brochures spread on our kitchen table and the word legacy, which had sounded like a joke until it became collateral. If I refused to sign, I might lose my exit bonus or worse. If I signed, I would ruin a man's life just to keep a promise I made to a future that had not met me yet. I poured coffee I didn't drink and watched the clock because time makes cowards and heroes out of the same person depending on when you ask them a question. I remembered my first day in 1983 when an old foreman named Riley told me this place will make you choose between being a good man and being a good employee. He laughed then, but not like it was funny, more like he was remembering the bill. I remembered 2005 when a winter storm turned the roof into a sieve and water ran down the racks like veins. Marcus stayed till midnight laying tarps as if he owned the inventory with his name on none of it. He had no car, so I drove him home to a one-room walk-up where the heater made more noise than heat. He handed me a Christmas card his little sister had drawn, a crooked tree and a stick figure in a hard hat, and wrote "Thank you, Mr. Ellery" in pencil that smudged under my thumb. I kept that card in my bottom drawer until the edges curled. I had forgotten it until the folder made me remember everything I owed and to whom. At lunch I walked the floor pretending to check for leaks and loose bolts. I watched Marcus load pallets with the patience of a man who knows hurry costs more than time. He double-checked straps and steadied a wobbling stack with his palm. He nodded at me like a man who still believed work had honor. Those were not the hands of a thief. Those were the hands of someone in debt to gravity and family and rent. In the maintenance bay, where coffee was always burnt and gossip always undercooked, I asked if anyone had seen the regional manager on the dock after hours. Luis raised his eyebrows and said he saw him near the scanner last Thursday with a clipboard at 9:40 when the floor was supposed to be clear. He said maybe he was doing a surprise audit. He said maybe audits don't wear cologne that strong. I thanked him and left before curiosity turned polite. That night my wife laid out 2 brochures and a calculator like a map and a compass. She asked whether the cruise or the train trip should go first. I looked at the calculator like it was a detonator. I said maybe wait for my last check. She pushed her glasses down her nose and asked, what are you not saying? I said nothing, just stress. She said you are 2 days from retirement, stress should be afraid of you by now. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand and told me not to let them pile one more thing on me. I thought about telling her the price of courage. I went to the garage instead and stared at the Buick for answers a carburetor can't give. I wondered if Marcus still carried the same wrench in his backpack just in case life broke in the middle of a shift. Thursday dawned with damp heat and a haze that made the parking lot look farther away. I walked the floor early pretending to care about a guardrail, while counting the steps between Marcus and the dock door. In the break room I heard him on the phone with a voice he only used for fear. He said, "Yes, Mama, I'll send the payment Friday, the rent will be on time." He hung up and saw me in the doorway and straightened his back like a soldier. He asked, "Everything okay, Mr. Ellery?" I said, "Just checking." He smiled to reassure me. That smile followed me back to my office like a rebuke I had earned. I sat with the folder and the coffee and the clock and weighed a pension against a man. Then I did something I had not done in years. I left a paper trail on purpose. I drove to the Union Hall because old habits know where the doors are. The steward has known me since I swept bolts off the floor for overtime candy. He poured 2 coffees that tasted like penance and read the printouts I slid across the table. Scanner logs showed entries after hours when the badges didn't. He whistled low and said, "This smells like a setup, but smell is not evidence." He said, "If you go loud, they will say you doctored it." He said, "You need chain of custody and someone in accounting with a spine." I thought of Carol, who answers straight even when straight bends. He told me to talk to her off the clock. He told me to bring copies, not originals. He told me to remember I am 2 days from a cliff and the view is deceptive. Carol chose a diner at the county line where the pie is honest and the lighting flat. She wore her hair up like the truth might try to grab it. She read the copies and kept her face quiet. She said the regional manager submitted a reimbursement coded as loss mitigation for an amount that looks like the gap plus 10%. She said she could send me the ledger entry from her personal email if I promised not to drag her into a bonfire. I said I could not promise the temperature of the future. I said I could promise not to light it for fun. She told me her father said there is no soft way to stand up straight. She pressed send under the table as if righteousness needed privacy. I left her a tip that said thank you without saying follow me. At home, my wife muted the TV and said talk. I told her everything from the folder to the offline cameras to the Union coffee to the diner pie. Her face went pale and then solid. She said, "Do what you have to do." She said, "We've lived on less before and we can live on less again." She said, "Do not come home a liar because I do not know how to live with one." Something inside my chest untied a knot it had tied in 1983. We watched a travel show with the volume low, and the narrator talked about rivers that cut stone given enough time. I wondered what a man looks like when his own river shows up on his last week. Friday morning smelled like rain and endings. I laced my boots like a ritual and kissed my wife like a vow. At the plant, my manager stood outside my office with a security guard like he was posing for a poster about power. He said, "Corporate will handle Marcus without you, so hand in your badge." He held an envelope that looked heavier than paper. I said, "Fine, but I am going to HR with everything." He said, "Do that, and your pension is gone." I said, "Then it's gone." He blinked like a man and used to straight lines. In HR, the director tried to route me to a conference room with a junior lawyer and a fake fern. I said no. I laid the logs and Carol's email and my resignation letter on her desk. I said I will not fire an innocent man to protect a thief. She read in silence, then called legal with a voice that had too many commas. An hour later, a guard walked me to the door without cake or speeches. Outside the gate, the rain came hard enough to bless. I drove home with the plant shrinking in the mirror like a ship I had survived. My wife had 2 mugs ready and a third chair pulled out like she expected a ghost. I told her about the badge and the escort, and the HR call that sounded like a weather report. She put both hands on my face and said, "We will manage because we always have." She said I married a man, not a paycheck. I laughed and cried and felt my breath return to my body. She stacked the brochures and said maybe we take the road trip instead of the cruise. I said maybe the road is better anyway because it does not pretend to be still when it is not. The first week after was a long hallway of quiet. No horn. No steel. No clock that decides who you are at 6 a.m. Some mornings I woke at 4 with the taste of oil in my mouth and a question in my chest. Did I just trade security for a story? On the 10th day, the union steward's envelope came with a note that said whistleblower protections apply and your pension stands pending investigation. I sat at the kitchen table and cried into my coffee like it was holy water. My wife covered my hand with hers and said, "See, integrity charges interest, but it pays. 3 weeks later, the regional paper ran a small story above the fold about inventory fraud at our plant. It named nobody and said everybody. It said 2 managers suspended pending investigation. It said an hourly employee reinstated with back pay. It did not say Marcus, but I heard his name between the lines. That evening, someone knocked on our door with the polite panic of a man who has never been to a stranger's porch with gratitude in both hands. Marcus stood there holding a thank you card and a photo of a newborn with hair like static. He said, "You saved my job when I needed it most." I said, "You saved my Buick in the winter of 2005, and I only had $20 cash, and you refused it." He laughed and wiped his eyes with the back of his wrist. We shook hands too long, and not long enough. He said, "If you ever need anything, call me." I said, "Be the man your son thinks you are." He nodded like a promise he had already made to himself. We didn't take the cruise. We took the road trip. We followed the river that cut the county in half and ate pie where the waitress wrote our names on the ticket like we were regulars in a life we had not lived yet. My wife asked across a booth with a knife nick in the formica if I regretted it. I said not for a second, because a pension that costs a man his name is a tax you pay forever. She squeezed my fingers and said, "Then this coffee tastes better." We laughed the way we had laughed when we were young and broke, the laugh that makes neon look like sunrise. Back home I still woke sometimes before dawn with the phantom horn in my ears. I pictured the folder and the pen and the guard and the rain and the door opening in my own chest. I thought of Riley's old warning about good men and good employees, and I wondered why it took me 40 years to answer a question I heard on day 1. Then I looked at the travel map on the wall and the photo of Marcus's son on the fridge, and I knew. Some questions only accept an honest answer when your hands are empty enough to carry it. If you had waited your whole life for the comfort you were promised, and your boss told you to protect it by firing an innocent man whose hands you taught to be steady, what would you do? Would you sign and sleep on a bed stuffed with your reasons? Or would you walk into the rain and keep your name? The week after the article broke was not silence, it was a storm disguised as paperwork. The phone rang twice from blocked numbers. Once a man's voice told me whistleblowers end up alone. The second time no one spoke, but I could hear factory noise in the background. I hung up both times and wrote down the hours in a notebook, because habit teaches you to keep records when truth gets slippery. A letter came from corporate lawyers asking me to attend a voluntary interview. The steward told me voluntary is code for trap. He said if they want you they will subpoena. Until then, stay quiet. He said, eat pie with your wife and let the storm hit the men who built it. But storms find cracks, and mine was the mailbox. A thick envelope arrived with a non-disclosure agreement, and a check so big my hand trembled. The note said sign and the matter disappears. I stared at the check until the ink looked like oil, and then I slid it back in the envelope and burned it in the fire pit. The flames turned green and blue, and my wife stood beside me silent. When the paper curled into ash, she said, "Now you've really retired." I said, "Now I've really begun." But the plant wasn't done with me. 2 weeks later, a man in a suit and a badge from corporate security knocked on the door. He asked if I had copies of the documents I gave to HR. I said no, because they were already with the union. His eyes flicked around my living room like he was taking inventory. I told him my wife was a nurse who knew how to call the police faster than he could write a report. He left without finishing his coffee. I wrote his plate number in my notebook. That night Marcus called for the first time, his voice steady but low. He said, "Mr. Ellery, I think they're watching me too." I said, "Then we'll watch back." I told him to keep a journal of everything strange, times, dates, faces, because truth is stronger when it carries a calendar. The investigation stretched months, headlines shrank from fraud to mismanagement, managers quietly resigned. And Marcus kept his job but lived like a man on trial. He called me sometimes after shift to ask how you know. If you're still standing straight, I told him, you know, because when you lay down at night you don't rehearse lies, you rehearse tomorrow. One night he confessed he thought about quitting because the whispers hurt. I told him quitting would make the liars right. Staying would turn whispers into echoes. He stayed. Then came the subpoena, a neat packet delivered by a deputy with a tired smile. I was to testify in a civil case against the regional manager, fraud, misuse of funds, wrongful termination attempts. I felt the weight of 40 years in one envelope. In court, the lawyer asked me if I was loyal to the company. I said I was loyal to work and to men who gave it honestly, but not to thieves hiding in the office. The gallery murmured. The judge told them to be quiet. Marcus sat behind me in a cheap suit too big for his shoulders. When I finished testifying, he mouthed thank you, and I felt younger than I had in decades. The verdict came weeks later. The regional manager fined 2 supervisors barred from future employment. Marcus cleared publicly. My pension intact. When the news ran on TV, my wife poured 2 glasses of cheap wine and toasted not to victory but to honesty. She said honesty ages better than money. I believed her because she had lived both with me. After court, Marcus brought his newborn again. This time the baby grabbed my finger with a fist the size of a walnut. Marcus said his name is Joseph. I looked at him stunned, and he said it's not for you exactly. It's for the idea of a man who doesn't look away. I swallowed hard and said then raise him so he never has to choose between being a good man and a good employee. Marcus nodded like he had already carved it in stone. The plant horn still echoes in my dreams. Sometimes I wake at 5 a.m. and for a second I think I'm late. Then I roll over and see my wife breathing steady and the map on the wall with pins in places we have not been yet, and I realize I am exactly on time. We took that road trip and added towns just because the highway looked kind. We ate pie in diners where no one knew my name, and it felt like the cleanest kind of freedom. One night in a motel with a broken sign, my wife asked, "Do you miss it?" I thought about the folder, the pen, the rain, the guard, the courtroom, and I said I missed the men but not the machine. She kissed my cheek and said, "Then you're free. If you had given 40 years to a company, and on your last week they asked you to trade a man's life for your comfort, would you sign and walk away with money? Or would you refuse and risk everything, knowing the road ahead might be harder but your name would stay yours?"